Hello, everybody, and welcome to today's episode. I'm your host, Vlad Benn. I'm the Policy and Research Manager at GIIA, and I lead our ESG work streams. I'm excited to dive into one of the most transformative, maybe divisive topics, depends what side of the Atlantic you're on, in finance today, sustainability in the asset management industry. In recent years, we've seen a huge wave of change from regulatory frameworks like the EU's Sustainable Finance Disclosure to shifts in investor approaches to how ESG is integrated. A lot of those advancements haven't been without challenges, and the politicization of ESG and accusations of greenwashing, increasing complexity in reporting, they've left a lot of people questioning whether sustainability is really embedded or worth the time, and whether the industry is still really finding its footing. So, really pleased to say I'm joined by Natalie, who'll share her insights on these key issues, and together we'll explore the evolution of sustainability, some of the key trends, what's really going on, what's going to go on in 2025. So great to have you, Natalie. Please introduce yourself.
Thanks a lot, Vlad. I'm happy to be here. I'm Natalie Sinha. I work at UBS Asset Management, and my role is Head of Sustainability for the Infrastructure Investments Platform. And great to be here with the GIIA because we've been working together on sustainability and part of your sustainability working group for the past few years. So yeah, excited to be here.
Great. Certainly appreciate all the help you've given us over this year and last year. Thank you. As we kind of outlined in the start, sustainability has undergone a lot of changes, and whether it's policies or regulations that are aimed at integrating ESG, it's all reshaped how asset managers operate. And in many ways, sustainability, I think everyone says each year, it's no longer a niche that needs to be considered. It's now kind of part and parcel of every asset manager investor's world, essentially. I don't see as that being the kind of full picture. As we've seen sustainability mature, so have a lot of the challenges that it's kind of facing. So some investors are speaking about, I think, an SI recession, green hushing, where fears of litigation risk are kind of stopping investment managers from talking about all the good things that they're doing, right? And at the same time, and I'm sure we'll get onto later, is politics is playing a pretty big role here. You're seeing a lot of pushback across the world, particularly when there's an impact on consumers and their bills. So that's a good bit of context for our first question. So how do you think the current landscape of ESG compares to, what we had previously?
Yeah, so I'd say that things have changed at a very rapid pace. A few years ago, we had a bit of a revolution in the asset management industry and for financial market participants. In 2021, the revolution came in the form of SFDR and its initial implementation, so the EU's Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulations. And it's probably fair to say that it changed the way people were thinking about sustainability, and it took a few years for people to get their head around it, for it to be embedded in the things that we do. Now, I would say it's embedded and integrated. And to a certain extent, sustainability is part of business as usual for some pockets of the asset management industry. However, there are still a large amount of traditional investments, though, that don't integrate ESG and purely seek a financial return objective. But as you mentioned, there is a little bit of a sustainability recession happening and some green hushing and like a little bit of an anti-ESG backlash. And I think to a certain extent, people got a little bit too excited a few years ago, right? Like everyone was badging everything as sustainability focused. Everyone thought this was the new big business, basically. People potentially were overclaiming what they were actually doing for sustainability. So I think it's kind of like a little bit of a balancing position that's happening. So I think people are being a bit more careful about what they're actually saying that they're doing, making sure that they're not overclaiming, they're being misleading in what they're doing. And the politics around the world is playing into some of the anti-ESG movements. So in the US election and another Trump term, people were expecting this to have quite a big impact. But the anti-ESG movement had been growing before that, especially in the US.
Just on the kind of politics and ESG, post-Trump election, I think we're probably likely to see a lot more scrutiny of ESG investing. I think this could come in, new regulations from the SEC, even though they've haven't really put out that many regulations, as we know, and maybe a little bit of kind of legislative rollback as well, which will probably limit some of the mandates that sustainability is having in the US. I think we've seen a lot of flashes of this anti-ESG rhetoric kind of extend beyond the US. So in the UK and the EU, debates have often centered around kind of costs and the costs of the green transition. And I think politicians have increasingly criticized the kind of ESG regulations that we've had so far because they've been appealing to voter concerns around a lot of these issues. And these issues have been around affordability and quite a lot of practicality in our current economy. In the UK as well, people have been questioning the impact of ESG on energy costs and industrial competitiveness. And that's kind of further fueling skepticism. And I think in the EU, while regulations are really robust, and the EU has been kind of a leader in a lot of these sustainability regulations, right? A lot of member states, and you're seeing a lot of politicians coming out now in fear that all of these new sustainability regulations, financial regulations are actually overburdening a lot of industries, and that could really hamper their kind of competitiveness at a global scale, particularly when we have, the US come out with their Inflation Reduction Act, all their infrastructure policies and incentives, and the EU has been playing catch up for a while. So I think the US is probably becoming a bit of an outlier in this kind of anti-ESG pushback. And the trajectory for me for ESG seems pretty clear. We've got public demand, there's global energy transition, and this institutional investor pressure. And I think that'll kind of continue driving the momentum. And I know I cut you off there, Natalie, but I hope I've covered a few things about the political side. And kind of, do you agree? What's your view on that?
Yeah, I mean, a lot to unpack on this topic. I think the backlash against ESG, you mentioned people were talking about the cost of net zero and everything like that. I think that is kind of a bit misleading. I think that actually net zero in the end means things will become more affordable. Energy will become more affordable. And the costs of not doing net zero are way higher to the global economy than actually doing it. If you look at like climate risk and what's happening there, with all the catastrophes happening across the world and the billions that these storms in the US are actually causing, especially to the insurance industry. And on anti-ESG, I mean, I think with anything, it's healthy to be skeptical about anything that's kind of like forced on people, right? And like, ESG in the end is fundamentally like a political topic. It's basically about like what type of world do you actually want to have? Like what type of social political dynamics do you really want to see? So you can see why it's like a contested topic. And I think that some of the anti-ESG movement has like some valid points. And Alex Edmonds has written quite a bit about this, but basically to a certain extent, ESG, I think, was forced on the market. And, you could argue that ESG itself shouldn't be put on a pedestal like compared to other value drivers. It's no better or worse than other factors that drive long-term value. And a few years ago, I think people thought ESG was the new big business, and this belief built up that ESG funds systematically outperformed non-ESG funds. But actually, the evidence is a lot more ambiguous around that. So I think with all these things, we need to embrace differences of opinion and be realistic about the fact that these are actually like political topics that we're talking about. So you're never going to reach complete consensus on everything. I agree with you that I think the trajectory is quite clear, that overall sentiment is positive on sustainability topics. People want clean energy. Investors have conviction around these topics. And the energy transition is accelerating in most places of the world. But I think what's happening is people are kind of getting bored of like, Article 8, Article 9, that's kind of embedded now. So people want to move beyond those bare minimum disclosures and into a new era of sustainability. And I think the baseline has risen in terms of what like sustainability integration looks like. So it's moving a bit more towards impact measurement and outcome focused investing, I would say.
Very good. And I suppose the other topic we touched on is that decarbonisation and how ESG is impacting that. So it's kind of been the corner of a lot of sustainable investing and, investments in renewables, in wind, solar, and now there's hushed whispers about hydrogen kind of coming to play a role. They're all capturing the spotlight and they're attracting billions of investments. I think out of the funds, maybe this is a throwaway stat, but I think maybe 60% of all capital raised has been towards those kind of energy transition funds, right? So it's attracting a lot of funding. And the focus is really understandable because, meeting net zero targets is not really an optional goal at the moment. We have a lot of these targets enshrined in law in some countries. So the need to get to 2030, the need to get to 2045, and the need to get to 2050 is becoming really important now. And it's also worth asking whether this kind of huge focus on purely the energy transition risks overshadowing other sectors. So, if you're thinking about transport, healthcare, utilities, they're all playing a big role in our lives. And they also require significant investment to get to a sustainable future, but probably receive a little bit less attention than, new, green, exciting wind farms, solar fields, etc. So what do you think, Natalie, on the energy transition sectors? Are they overshadowing investment in others? What's your take?
Yeah, I mean, in infrastructure, people who work in the sector will be familiar with the 4Ds. So decarbonisation, digitalisation, deglobalisation and demographic change. So our view is that these global social, environmental and economic trends are shaping the future of infrastructure investments. I completely agree with you, though, that the focus is still a lot on decarbonisation and energy transition. That's just what people seem to want. Institutional investors, they want this. They've got their net zero targets and it's just kind of like an easy play, I would say. So I think the focus is still on like environmental and energy transition. But even with all of the focus there, there's still a huge annual investment gap of 3 trillion between now and 2050 to meet net zero. And reducing emissions is only one part of it, right? Above that, you have this whole suite of investments that are needed to actually innovate and bring emissions down. People moving beyond traditional renewables like solar and wind, because those investments have fallen in terms of financial returns compared to a few years ago. We're trying to look at the new frontier of transition investing. So some areas that we see as quite exciting are energy storage, which we think is a growing and important part of the puzzle. And that's because renewables are intermittent and weather dependent. And the batteries charge with cheap renewable energy and then they discharge when there's fossil fuel generation on the grid. So they incidentally buy low and sell high. And then transport investments as well, you mentioned, they contribute 25% of global carbon emissions every year, but it's often forgotten and left out of the conversation. And transport needs between 5 to 8 times the capital compared to renewables, and also hard to abate sectors as well, like industrials, transport, agriculture and buildings. They contribute about half of global emissions. But one thing I wanted to mention is that governments continue to heavily subsidise the use of fossil fuels. And in 2023, there was 620 billion in fossil fuel subsidies, which takes the form of direct grants, vouchers, tax reductions and other types of price regulations, which is significantly above the 70 billion spent on clean energy. So I think this is something that urgently needs addressing in order to unlock a net zero future.
I suppose something we haven't touched on is the kind of digitization that you mentioned of the 4Ds. Everyone's favorite topic at the moment, data centers, digital infrastructure. In Europe, at least, a lot of these conversations have been dominated by energy dependency, security of supply, and that kind of transition to a green energy system. Yet, in my mind, we're intent on building these huge warehouses which suck up as much energy and water as major European cities, right? So how can we reconcile that kind of demand, the need to decarbonize with data centers and that kind of thirst for information that we've got at the moment?
I love data centers. They're one of my favorites. So yes, I think data centers, the trend for data centers, when you look at it, is just upward, really rapid growth. And there's been a 20% compound annual growth rate data centers for many years. And global data demand is only expected to go up. So in the 5-year period of 2027, it's tripling. AI, everyone's favorite topic now, is only going to add to this. These things have reached the mainstream. So this year, ChatGPT AI into the mainstream, it uses 10 times as much electricity than a standard Google search. So the sustainability focus on data centers is only growing. And data centers are essentially a very large fridge with lots of equipment in them. So they need to be kept at a really nice, cool...
Putting out potent gases.
Yeah, they need to be kept at a really nice, cool temperature, and they've got all this equipment in them. They're generally seen as like environmental monsters, right? Because they're power hungry, they're energy intensive. As you mentioned, they can use a lot of water as well, depending on the type of cooling system that you have. And they have these really potent greenhouse gases in their cooling system. One of my favorite facts is about the global warming potential of the refrigerant gases in data centers, which can be, in the thousands, because it has to be quite potent to make sure that it can cool the data center. There's all these types of considerations. But on the flip side, I think that there's not many other industries that are looking at energy efficiency in such a serious way and thinking about how they can optimize their energy efficiency. So it's monitored using power usage efficiency, and that's like typically between 1 to 3, and like 1 is lowest end and then 3 is typically on the higher end, but it can be a bit higher than 3 as well. These data centers are doing so much. Some of the investments that we have in data centers, they continually monitor their energy usage. They're looking at how to optimize it. They've been switching from this thing called adiabatic cooling, which is quite water intensive, to free cooling technology. And that's reduced their water consumption by up to 70%. Realistically, though, these data centers, if they're just going on an upward trajectory, absolute emissions are going to go only one way. They're only going to go up. So I think that we need to be just conscious of this and think about, what opportunities we get from that as well. So they generate, because they're keeping the temperature cool, they also generate quite a lot of heat. So that heat could be reused in lots of different ways. It's relatively low grade, the heat, like 40 to 60 degrees. But it can be used in buildings for heating water or for district heat networks. And one thing that I came across recently is on some of these massive data center sites, they can have greenhouses where they're basically growing vegetables like on the site, reusing that heat that way. Realistically, data centers aren't great for the environment. Like the most sustainable data center is one that we already have or not a new one. But, we need to meet growing demand for data centers and for AI. So we just need to make sure that we're really thinking seriously about the energy efficiency, reducing the impact of them. But also one other dynamic is about how data centers are interacting with renewables. So because power constraint is one of the biggest constraints on data center growth, what we're anecdotally hearing about is how data center growth is driving renewable investment in a lot of places of the world. So renewable developers are going to data centers and basically asking them to build renewables next to their new data centers. So I think that's quite an interesting little interaction going on.
Yeah, well, you're seeing a lot more data center operators and developers start to look at procuring different forms of power, right? I think you saw Google, Meta, all looking at small modular reactors as one way to power a lot of their data centers. So we'll see how that plays out. And actually, I was on a call from GIIA talking about how they are looking at working with data centers a bit more closely on helping them procure a lot of that power. And she said a lot of the comments and a lot of the requirements they have is for almost 500 megawatts to gigawatts of power required for a lot of these data centers.
Crazy, yeah.
She said that's complete madness. That's 500 megawatts is how much the city of Miami takes in.
Yeah,
we're not just going to provide you with all of this power, right?
That's crazy. I think it's something that's going to be quite interesting how it plays out, because who gets to decide these things? Like, who gets the power, right? Are you going to give it to a data center, or are you going to give it to like a housing area that needs power? So I think that it is quite like a political issue, this like access to power, and we do see like in some areas like a bit of power grabbing going on. Yeah, so I think that would be quite interesting to see how that plays out.
You have seen a bit of a reaction from governments as well, right? In Ireland, particularly, I think it's Ireland, China, Singapore, Germany, to name a few, have already started putting caps on the amount of kind of demand that data centers can place on the electricity grid.
Yeah, exactly.
So we're slowly seeing a government reaction to this data. But if there is demand for it from the consumers, if AI continues to grow at this exponential rate, then who knows, maybe we'll all be living in data centers.
Yeah. I mean, up until now, though, data centers have kind of escaped the spotlight, right? Until a few years ago, no one even knew what a data center was, right? You were just like surfing the web and like having a great time. But you didn't know that it was all happening in a data center. So, and because of that, to a certain extent, they kind of escaped like regulation, really. So I think they're kind of, it's kind of catching up with them. And like on the environmental side, there's really not that much actual data center regulation in place. So I think that's something that's going to have to keep pace with data center growth.
Yeah, clearly put data centers into everyone's cookbooks.
Yeah.
So, to move on from data centers, we talked a little bit about regulation, and I suppose it's a good time to talk about it in depth. So it's kind of been this double-edged sword for sustainability. You know, on the one hand, you've had policies and regulatory packages from the US and the EU, that have really unlocked capital for green investments. But on the other hand, you've got huge complexity in reporting regulations. I'm thinking of the EU, and that's creating A, confusion, B, a lot of burden for asset managers. So do you think the current wave of regulations, EU, US, wherever it's coming from, is that kind of helping or hindering the flow of investment?
Yeah, I mean, it's the $1 million question, isn't it? I think we've seen some policy packages across the world that have genuinely helped investment go in the right places. So the US Inflation Reduction Act and the EU's Green Deal Fit for 55 packages have been helpful policy packages. We need consistent policy that makes the investment fundamentals work at the end of the day. I mean, the US IRA up until now has been hailed as a success story. So 3.4 million Americans unaccessed inflation reduction tax credit equivalent to 8.4 billion USD, which means that families save up to a third off heat pumps, insulation, rooftop solar, so which helps lower the cost of clean energy. And also, since the IRA came about, there's been announcements of 900 billion in clean energy investments, including 265 billion specifically in clean energy that's created over 330,000 jobs. So I think when the regulation genuinely helps capital flow in the right direction, we're supportive of that. The IRA after Trump, there's like a question mark around what's going to happen there. I think that the markets at the minute might be underestimating the scale of the IRA rollback. And our sort of base case is that there's a partial repeal of the IRA. So that could have like differing impacts. But I think the outlook for energy investors is still quite positive, and it's like quite a resilient sector. And there's still a favourable sentiment from the public and from investors on this. But on your question on like the reporting side of things and whether that actually helps, I think there's a question mark around that, because it's just been the case that there's more and not any rationalization between the different regulations. So, we've got SFDR, we've got CSRD, CSDDD, there's the UK SDR, there's the ESMA naming guidelines. There's basically everything you can think of. And it really does add quite a big burden to sustainability in the asset management industries. Yeah, I do think that's something that does need to be addressed. And also when you have all these regulations that potentially interact with each other, there's that complexity around how do you actually operate in that environment where you've got all of these different regulations at play, and you need to make sure that it's consistent.
On the IRA, the tax incentives, manufacturing grants, etc., I think they've been pretty revolutionary for the US. And maybe prior to Trump coming in, there was a lot of fear that he was going to repeal a lot of these tax credits. But in my mind, that's always been less likely. I mean, when you think or when you look at the states that are benefiting the most from clean energy investment, clean kind of tax investment and jobs, I think 7 of the top 10, if you look at jobs created, are Republican states. It's a similar number for amount of investment gained from these tax credits in the US. They're mostly Republican states. And we saw the letter going into the government from Republican senators saying that essentially, don't repeal this. This is creating a lot of economic activity in our state. So I think I kind of half agree that Trump is going to be, I think, maybe rolling back a little bit, because, it's been basically a free-for-all from Biden, just trying to get money out the door as quickly as possible. And for the people that have already claimed the tax credits, there is also a healthy transfer of credit market at the moment as well. First Solar alone, which is one of the biggest solar manufacturers in the US, they have something like $800 million of tax credits, which can be bought in the market. So I think even though you may see a bit of a scale back in the tax credits available, there's still a lot of tax credits in the market that can be bought, maybe not at full price, but a bit of a discount. So
yeah, no, I agree. I think the jury's out a little bit on what the impact of that will actually end up being. I think at the state level, they have quite a lot of powers, don't they?
Yeah. For me as well, I know we touched on regulation and reporting. I think regulation works best when it provides kind of that clear and long-term signal, which align with kind of market fundamentals. So without consistent policy, and this is something that we say at GIIA all the time, without that clear and consistent policy, investors really struggle to make confident decisions. And you've seen that take effect in the UK. You've seen that misunderstanding of policy or misalignment of policy affect investments in Germany, whether it's in hydrogen, other areas. It's really critical that what government says and what regulation does, they all align, because infrastructure investors are looking to deploy capital over a much longer time horizon than, unfortunately, politicians are in power. So there's always going to be that kind of misalignment.
Definitely.
So with the reporting, I know you touched on ESMA, CSRD, SFDR, the SFDR 2.0, there's so many of them. How are you dealing with all of this? Surely it must take up so much time.
Yeah, it's a struggle. I mean, I think that SFDR now, people have got their head around it, right? We know what it means. But obviously, as you mentioned, SFDR 2.0 is basically a consultation on should we just rip this whole thing up and start again? So so we'll have to see what happens there. But realistically, that's a few years off anyway. CSRD is touted as the new big one. So that's the EU's Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. And basically what that means is people need to know what their impacts, risks and opportunities are. And it brings in this new concept of double materiality as well. So it's basically instead traditional sustainability reporting is just what impact are we having on the world? But it's also the other way around. So it's basically saying what impact is the world potentially having on us? And I mean, that affects large companies in the EU and also outside the EU as well. So some companies that have a presence in the EU are going to be hit by that, which I think is causing a little bit of a kerfuffle. But yeah, and then there's a whole range of other regulations. But I'd say those are kind of the main ones that are hitting us. And one thing to highlight is basically that the regulation as currently designed, SFDR at least, and the EU taxonomy, there's a little bit of a gap for transition frameworks in the current regulation. So the EU taxonomy, which is a catalogue of sectors of what the EU thinks could be sustainable, only really allows for already green investments. So what we're seeing is that a lot of banks are coming up with their own view on what transition investing actually looks like.
Yeah, there's kind of lack of definitions are really causing problems. And a big learning point for the UK as it's undergoing its own list of activities that are considered green, right? I know the EU managed to get natural gas and nuclear into their taxonomy. So,
that was not very popular.
Big win for France and Germany. But yeah, I suppose the reporting challenge is a real paradox. While transparency has increased, we've seen that compliance-driven reporting has prioritized a bit of checkboxing and pure compliance, which isn't really what investors should be doing. They should be really driving kind of meaningful action rather than just, ticking boxes, as we said. And there must be a bit of a convergence. We always talk about, how to simplify reporting. And that's really on regulators to kind of maybe take a little bit of a step back and take a look at what's in there at the market and how they can streamline it. The ISSB is trying to do that, and there's a few districts and regions in Asia that are picking it up and using it. So hopefully that'll drive a bit more convergence.
Yeah, I mean, I'm still a skeptic on that one. I'm not going to lie. I think it's just really confusing. And there's just so many different routes that you have to report under. And it's also not just regulatory reporting, right? That's one piece of the puzzle, but there's also all your client requests from investors and all forms of other reporting as well. So I think I'm still a little bit skeptical that streamlining is going to happen anytime soon.
Well, you look at the accountancy standards. I mean, when did they first come out? They weren't first formalized until 90s, 2000s, right? And it took about 25 years for formal standards to come about that everyone was happy with. Yeah. Now we look at ESG thinking, it's going to happen in the next 5 years. I think it's probably a long
Yeah, I might be retired in 25 years.
You'll be advising on what the best ones are.
Yeah.
Great. So I think we've covered a lot of ground here, and I suppose the only thing left is to really look ahead to what's going to happen in 2025. Sustainability is always evolving. The industry is grappling with a lot of these challenges we talked about: politicization, regulation, reporting, decarbonization, etc. So let me ask you, Natalie, what do you foresee 2025 being for sustainable investment? Where's it going?
Sure. So if I look in my crystal ball, I can tell you that I think that the macroeconomic and political backdrop is going to continue to shape things. We're going to see a continuing shift to impact and outcome focused sustainable investing. On the one hand, you're also having like this green hushing and anti-ESG, and on the other, like a continuing trend towards more sustainable investing. We're going to see regional variations continuing. So the EU kind of sailing away in its own direction, US counterparts potentially in another direction, then like APAC and Australasia as well. A lot coming in there. Litigation as well is a huge one. So it's kind of like linked to the sustainability recession and green hushing. Some quite high profile cases actually happening like right now about like sustainability labeling. I think more regulation on sustainability disclosure, hopefully helpful policy packages that move capital to the right place. But overall, though, I would say that there's a positive outlook for private infrastructure investments in general.
I think I agree. I think that transition finance probably a big piece of the puzzle as the global energy mix shifts. And I think there probably needs to be a bit more kind of guidance and sector frameworks and roadmaps from a lot of these countries to kind of highlight how public and private sectors can work together. Because, we talk about the infrastructure gaps across the world in the trillions, but it's both public and private sectors that need to work together to bridge that gap. Because, unfortunately, post-COVID, the public governments around the world don't really have enough money to be able to splurge on a lot of this big investments that's needed. So they really need to think about how they can involve the private sector in the best way possible. Natalie, I think we've probably let's leave it on that kind of cheery note. Sustainability is becoming definitely more integrated, hopefully more impactful and more central to our investment lives. So just want to say to our listeners, thank you very much for tuning in. We'd love to hear your thoughts. Do you see sustainability as an evolution? Is there convergence? Is it colliding with politics, innovation and sustainability? Where is it going? We'd love to hear from you. And stay tuned for more insights from the Talking Global Infrastructure podcast, and listen out to more podcasts on the future of finance.